So what do you got?
So mine was actually lighthearted kind of entrepreneurial spirit. This actually just showed up on my Google newsfeed. So it's a article written in Entrepreneur Magazine, and it's written by Maggie Ginsberg. And so it's a really well written article. It's more of like a kind of a narrative storytelling kind of article, and it goes through a couple different founders. But basically the gist of the article is moving home for entrepreneurs. So a lot of these entrepreneurs in the last like 20 years, if you wanted to start something, you had to pack up whatever you were doing and move to the coast. You had to move to New York, Boston, Silicon Valley, because that's where the talent was, that's where the investment money was, that's where you made tech startups, or you made startups, period, is you did that, unless you're building, a hardware store in Duluth, Iowa or something, you went to the coast to build your whatever app or store or whatever it is, because you had the resources there. And what they're saying now, and I've noticed this kind of in our kind of LinkedIn peripheral kind of content, is that a lot of this innovation, investment, startup scenes are happening and are thriving outside of the coast. And we see it here. Even though we are on a coast, Portland isn't really known to be like a mecca of startups like Silicon Valley or Boston or anything like that. And so I guess they go through a couple different stories, but they're talking about like places like Wisconsin and Pittsburgh and Indianapolis and these places that you wouldn't usually think of as tech startup hubs having really vibrant kind of entrepreneurial startup incubators that are well funded now, and that people are actually leaving the coast to come back to a hometown or to a place. And they give various reasons. They say that talent is rich because they are tech schools, and tech is basically invaded everywhere. So talent's good and cheap because you're in the Midwest. The price of like a headquarters or something is something like 1/12 of what it would be. 1/12 of what it would be, and then probably 100 times bigger than what you can get in Boston or New York or San Jose. And then on top of it, now there are investment clubs and people that have invested in startups that have made money, and now they're, it's kind of like a continuing loan fund or a grant fund for startups where these incubators are fully funded by investments in profitable businesses that they are then able to then return to the company. And some for-profit businesses have gotten into helping spur these innovations in their community. So I guess one of the things that I found funny in the article before I kick it to you guys for kind of questions was that one of the guys that was moving from San Francisco, he wanted to move to like Wisconsin or whatever, approached his possible investors about this and said, I'm thinking about moving there, and explained all the financial savings he would make off of this and how much farther their investment would go. And their answer to him was that they don't think that they could have ran the business or help him grow the business in like Indiana or wherever he was moving to outside of San Francisco. And I thought that was weird that here's these guys that really believe in tech and this, technology kind of startup culture, but they're not willing to remote manage their investments. They want it close to the vest.
Or to like really believe in tech.
Right. So I just get, I guess, lighthearted thing, but I wanted to get your guys' opinion on, do you think, like the concentration of those tech kind of startup incubator things are now moving away from the coast? Or do you think maybe this is just like a flash in the pan? Yeah, there's some money out there, but really to be successful in a startup or an entrepreneurial kind of venture, do you need to be on the coast, I guess, to get that kind of funding, that kind of exposure? Because you're not going to get the same kind of exposure in Indiana. I guess one of the ways the article put it was, if you do go and do these startups outside of those areas, you are kind of a big fish in a small pond if you're good. Mm-hmm. But then do you get the same exposure as being, a medium-sized fish in a huge pond?
I think it's one of those things that I think is working its way more towards what you're saying, where it's getting decentralized, and over time we're gonna see more and more of startups being happening all over. But I think it is, like you're saying, it's one of those things people get, tied up in their ways. And so even a company who knows it's the right thing doesn't want to necessarily put their money behind it because they're very traditional and they're very, used to being near the things that they're investing in. And so that's something that's hard for people to get past. But I think it's inevitable that it's going to begin to be more decentralized, because that's just the way of the world. I mean, that's the way of tech and the way of all these, what these startups are trying to do is closing those gaps and making things more widely available.
Yeah, it actually reminds me of a prior roundtable discussion we had. We were talking about the triangle of trade-offs. Mm-hmm. And I've heard this framed this way. It was on some other podcast that was talking about the tech community, and particularly those with funding, venture-backed funding. And so the trade-off, and I think it's currently this is in the zeitgeist of debate for the tech community, which is the three things that you're kind of trying to balance in terms of location of your headquarters and your kind of your main domicile of the business is balancing where your capital is. Should you be close to your capital, i.e. your funders, like the example you were talking about, with those investors that happen to be in the Bay Area? Or should you be where your customers are? Or should you be where your people are? And so which of those three things should win out? And so historically, one of the reasons why I think a lot of people think, oh, well, the Bay Area, Silicon Valley had kind of this concentration because they had all the talent, or all the talent was flocking there and the people were flocking there. And it's kind of a chicken or egg question, because the people were there, but also the VCs were there. So that's where the capital was too, right? So companies staying and starting in the same kind of traditional locations that they have had are companies that are basically on the side of, we need to be close to our capital. And I've seen that in practice, where if you need a lot of funding, it is going to be probably easier to get the funding if you're well networked in a community that funds, because going after funding is like, honestly, at the end of the day, it's like any other kind of sales activity. You're networking with lots of different people and building and maintaining that network. And so to the extent that you're doing that within a particular location, that there are a lot of people who invest in that, in tech enterprises, and that's what Silicon Valley offers, is kind of a concentration of investors in that way, then it may, logically, it seems to me it may be somewhat easier to raise some money there. And so I think companies that are choosing to still stay in more traditional locations, it's partly because they are on the side of, we should be close to our capital. I think a lot of these companies, the question of should we be close to our customer takes ironically somewhat a back seat, because they are digital type companies. So their products and service are offered, over the internet and the web in a lot of ways. And so being close to the customer is not, and they're rolling out national strategies. They're not rolling out businesses that are designed to just serve, say, the Bay Area, or just serve, whatever community that they happen to be in. And so there isn't really a prime location to necessarily be close to their customer. I think if you're B2B, like enterprise, like let's say you develop a SaaS product that is specifically designed for a certain industry, then being in a location where that industry actually happens to be, being close to your customer probably makes sense, right? But if you're B2C and you're kind of rolling out to people across the country, then maybe the location doesn't matter. So this is all one big long-winded way of saying, I think what you were describing and what you're talking about in terms of companies now kind of looking to be in different locations throughout the country and saying, we can be in lower cost places. We don't have to be in these kind of traditional hubs. That strikes me as a let's be close to our people strategy. Mm-hmm. That they're basically on those companies that are doing that. They're on the side of, we're going to go where the people are, and perhaps it's where there's a lower cost of living and the talent, there's good talent at a lower cost and all that, but it is a people first strategy as opposed to a capital or customer first strategy in terms of location. When I say a people first strategy, they're taking a people first strategy on where they locate themselves. And I would say one more wrinkle or irony to that point is it kind of if that's what they're doing, if companies are choosing to locate in places, it's kind of counterintuitive, right? Because you'd say, well, because of modern technology, we can be located anywhere. We don't have to be located in a traditional coastal hub city, right? But actually, it's almost the counterpoint, because to say that I'm going to go locate in, where was that, Wisconsin that we were talking about? Yeah, to say we're going to go locate in a small town in Wisconsin because there's a lower cost of living for our people and we can get talent there perhaps at a lower cost, means that you're not actually counting on being able to get people from anywhere. You're actually counting on all your people being in the same place, i.e. the lower cost of living location and the place where talent is a lower cost. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic it's kind of a counter argument, right? When as a company, if you're moving the entire company to these other locations outside the traditional hubs to be closer to your people, you've already adopted a thought process that your people are all going to be together. Otherwise, what would the point be? You could stay in the Bay Area or Seattle or LA or New York or one of these, in a hub like that, and just have your people live anywhere all over the country. And I've worked with companies that do that, and that's great. But if you're moving the entire company to one of these locations, then you must be saying that's not what we don't actually expect our people to be everywhere. We actually expect our people to kind of be here in this cool location that we found just for ourselves.
Yeah.
Well, and to be fair, when the one that I was referencing, the first one that they kind of based the story around was more like the interview that you had with VapeJet, where they're manufacturing like kind of a technology product. So there's like a it's not just
there is an element where
there is an
they
element
have to be
of
physically present.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And to your point, I think you could do both, right? You can have a physical manufacturing place like that, but you can have somebody do design in like Idaho or, you know what I mean? Like,
that's what I took from the article,
Right.
is that it's taking all the positions that can be done somewhere else and putting them in the places where it's more cost effective to do them. It's like design or like engineering.
Right. But the actual manufacturing where you need people on site, places like Detroit, lots of skilled workers with manufacturing experience, but not a lot of manufacturing jobs to go around. Mm-hmm. And so there was another startup that moved back to Detroit. Now, not 2010 Detroit, but 2018 Detroit. That's actually on the upswing. Mm-hmm. So I did think it was interesting to hear just kind of how an investor who was totally in on something like that, and probably, well, let me back up. The thing that I think was most kind of thought-provoking to me was we have all these like WeWork stories, or the one we did last week about the cannabis company where they're not profitable. And one of the reasons why they're not profitable is because of the overhead that they have associated with it, and then they get these investments to pump more money into the valuation. So, it's building off investment money that they're hoping to get back. Mm-hmm. And you're building kind of this unsustainable business propped up on free money. Yeah. You know what I mean? So if you're looking at a startup from more of like the way I think these entrepreneurials are looking at it, where they're really looking at it from almost like a financial first kind of perspective, where they're like, man, we can do so much more with our money and probably need to and raise less and have a profitable model if we're based somewhere in like Wisconsin, as opposed to if we're headquartered in London or Sydney or, some international hub, or in LA or Silicon Valley or Boston. And I think, you have a better chance of surviving or striving if you're looking from a financial first kind of perspective of like real bottom line issues like fixed assets and like these big investments that are needed for something like this.
Well, I think it also depends on like how different what your business that you're trying to start up does versus what other businesses in that arena are doing. If you feel like you have something that is totally new and that other businesses aren't doing, then you're not as interested in the existing skill sets that are out there in all these other tech hubs. You think that what you're doing is revolutionary and new, so you think you can establish your own talent and find your own people. And so you're willing to take a bet on a place that's different because you think you'd rather start that way and build your own system from the ground up. And so I think that's a factor that they think about too.
Yeah, I think the access to capital question is it is one of the essential questions there. And if you're going to need a lot of juice and you're going to need that juice to keep flowing, then it's not impossible to be outside of the mainstream locations, but I bet that if you do locate outside of the mainstream locations, the top executives have a lot of frequent flyer miles. I think they're traveling constantly back to network with the where the money is, because they're going to need more money, and so if it's like you say, like if you're not constantly juicing it, if you get some initial investment and you're going to carry a lot of the growth out of operating cash flow, then sure, it does, then maybe it's not as important that you kind of stay in the network,
Right.
because I mean, even in Portland, we're on the West Coast, and here in Portland, and we do get some VC backed tech companies here, but even in this location, it ends up requiring a lot of traveling on the part of the executives and on the part of the VCs themselves. Sometimes that VCs are traveling in here, sometimes the executives are traveling there, if it's the Bay Area or Seattle or wherever it is. But they've got to maintain those networks in order to maintain their access to the lifeblood, the cash that they're burning in order to develop their technology. So yeah, I mean I think that's the practical limitation of the whole thing.
Yeah, I think the real rub is like if there is enough investment in those smaller kind of startup communities, if there's enough to sustain something that's going to be large or something that has a long runway for profitability, is there enough, like you said, juice in that community to keep them afloat? And I think you're right. If something has a long runway like that, or if you're running thin margins and you're trying to build a larger customer base to, like an Amazon type thing where you're making pennies on the dollar, and you're just selling billions of dollars worth of stuff, then I think you're correct that I don't think you could do that in middle of nowhere Wisconsin. Sorry, Wisconsin, if you're listening. It's not the middle of nowhere. It's a beautiful country, but it's not Boston and it's not Silicon Valley as far as funding stock.
Well, and the article brought up another really good point that's in line with what you're saying, which is that a lot of the times when they went to these places that are less popular, that when the venture capitalists that ended up making money, basically when something took off, those venture capitalists didn't want to keep their money in that place. And so basically, even though that place was successful at bringing up some business from their bootstraps, it didn't result in a boon to that economy, because their choice to initially place themselves away from these tech hubs led the investors to then also take their profits and put them somewhere other than these tech hubs.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
that's unfortunate. Yeah.
So the investment capital doesn't go back to the hub, but for sure,
Yeah.
construction jobs, manufacturing jobs, or whatever other remedial jobs they have in the community is a boon.
Oh, for sure.
You know? So, but you're right. There's not this like revolving door of like of like a VC fund that's going to continually like churn out incubators.
Yeah, exactly.
With a scenario like you said. Now, I will say the article did mention that there's this huge investment in places like Pittsburgh, Wisconsin, Indianapolis. A lot of the recipients of like gig speed internet, when Google Fiber was doing it and stuff, laid the groundwork for there to be able to be this kind of Midwest tech kind of startup culture. And that some people did make it out and did make those, and then basically started their own small investment companies or firms by putting their money where their mouth was and going back to those hometowns. So,
yeah. Well, I mean, if I'm being less cynical, I think this is an efficiency of capital question, in the sense that if it actually is more efficient to be operating these businesses in these other locations, and what's really drawing people back to the hubs is just where the capital has to be located, or happens to be located, it doesn't have to be, but happens to be located, you would hope that the efficiency of the market would correct that, and eventually the capital would find its way over there. It's just the cynical side of me is like, yeah, but markets actually aren't that efficient, and the reality is that the reason why places are the hubs they are is because of of issues that aren't purely bottom line business issues, the quality of life issues, and the thing that people like. They like being in coastal town. There's a cachet value to being in those coastal communities, other than they're crowded as heck, right? But yeah, I think people like being in those places, and so then that drives capital there, and so capital isn't necessarily being deployed the most efficiently in that regard. But
And to your point, Ty, I don't think you're going to see, like, in the next 5 years, Madison, Wisconsin is all of a sudden the Silicon Valley of the Midwest. I don't think that's going to happen. I think, in 20 years, maybe.
Madison's on the list, though. When you say Madison, because I think it's like when you look at some of the towns, and I'll probably miss some of them in listing it, but it's like, Portland, I think, is one of those places a lot of people want to live. It's a lifestyle town. Madison, Austin, Texas.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, what we see in the tech community, this is another tangent, but we do see that in the tech community is where you're in a situation where your workforce can kind of be anywhere. There's kind of like this common list of places that your workforce ends up, like where developers end up going. It's like somewhere in Australia, somewhere in the UK, the Bay Area, Seattle, Portland, Austin, Texas, Madison.
Don't forget Indianapolis.
Okay.
Well, and the only reason I say that is because a while ago there was a study done on like the most livable place, I guess, in America. And Indianapolis was the one that got the nod because the median home price and the median salary matched. It was one of the few places in the country where, like if you made like $60,000 a year, you could afford to buy like a $100,000 home that was worth living in, or like a $200,000 home.
Yep.
That was well worth that price.
Yep. Unlike
what you would get in Portland or LA for that kind of money. A cardboard box on the side of the road, but
Right.
So, but then they also did the infrastructure upgrades.
Okay.
So, don't count on it. Shout out to Indianapolis.
Don't count out Indianapolis, and we're not counting out others that we missed on that list. We're not claiming to have the data, to have the expertise here to list everyone that is.
Unlike those other jerks on the coast, we don't call you guys flyover states. We value Middle America.
Right. Exactly. All right.
That's all I got.
Well, thank you guys. Yeah, I think this was a good session. We had some good things to talk about today. So I want to thank you both being here as always, AJ and Charlie, and to our viewers and listeners, thank you for joining us, and hit the subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube and the notification icon so that you know when we've got a new episode. And if you're listening on your podcast network, make sure to download us and subscribe to us so that you are staying up to date with our episodes as they come out weekly. So thanks again for joining us, and we will see you all next time.
See you next week.
Thank you.